All right, grab your responses to the knowledge, doubt, reason, and experience questionnaire that you completed at the very beginning of this thought primer, because we're going to go over all of those statements with the goal of trying to get a sense of where you are right now in relation to these questions about truth and belief and knowledge. All right, and we'll also look at what would be the implications of accepting some of these statements as true. In other words, what would also have to be true if we accept particular statements as true. All right, statement number 1 says this: it's impossible to ever truly know anything. All we can ever have are merely opinions and beliefs. If you agreed with this statement, then you likely disagreed with almost all of the statements that follow, because all of the statements that follow imply that knowledge is a possibility in some ways. But statement number 1 is a universal skepticism. It's the claim that knowledge is an impossibility. The best you can hope for are having beliefs and opinions about things, but you can't ever actually know anything. If you disagreed with statement number 1, though, you probably agree with statement number 2. It's possible to have objective knowledge of what reality is like in itself. So if you agree with number 2, essentially what you're saying is, look, I think I can have some amount of knowledge about some features of reality, and it's not just my opinion, it's not just my belief. The implications of these 2 statements are profound. Which one you choose to accept as true, which one you choose to believe is true and agree with, is going to have some profound implications. And I'll tell you that I've had lots of folks tell me they agree with statement number 1. I've never met anybody who actually does. And what I mean by that is I don't see them living in a way that's consistent with number 1. If you believe number 1, then what you're believing is that we're all sort of solipsistically locked into the prisons of our own minds, and we can never get outside of ourselves to have knowledge of what the structure of reality is like and what things are in and of themselves. And that would mean then that you wouldn't do things like go to doctors when you're ill or take your car to a mechanic when it's broken. Because if everybody's just stuck in their opinions and beliefs and we're all sort of living these solipsistic existences, then there would be no criteria by which we could judge the quality of these different opinions and beliefs. Right? We would just say, like, I don't know, it's what a doctor thinks, it's what the mechanic thinks, it's what my gardener thinks. But of course, that's not how most people live. When most people are ill, they go to a physician. And they go to the physician because, not just because the physician happens to have beliefs and opinions, it's the physician happens to have informed beliefs and opinions. In other words, they have some level of expertise about the human body or about body chemistry or whatever their specialty is. And so when you go there that you're not just getting their opinion, you're getting their informed opinion. They have knowledge of things, including you, as an object that exists independently of their opinions and beliefs. And it's the same thing with your mechanic, or if you're going to try to send a rocket to Mars, you probably want to have some physicists on your team, right? Because physicists understand they understand some of the ways that reality is structured that allows them to shoot a rocket at Mars and have it get there successfully. And that requires them to have knowledge about the way that reality is structured. It's not just that they have ideas that they formed by sitting in their bedroom staring at the wall. They've actually learned about the world out there, and then that knowledge informs their opinion. So if you were to agree with number 1 and be consistent, then you would have to scrap the idea of expertise. If you were to agree with number 1 and be consistent, you would have to scrap the idea that it's possible for you to have a meaningful shared experience with another human being, because you wouldn't be having an experience of some feature of reality. You'd be having an experience of your opinions and your beliefs, and those would be happening sort of in the prison of your own mind. And the same thing with the other person. But the implications for accepting number 2 are also profound, right? Because now what you're claiming is that you have some knowledge about the way that reality is that's not just your opinion. It's not just your belief. It's actually based on something. And so that raises the question, like, well, how do we acquire this knowledge? Well, you have reason, the capacity for reason, and you have experiences, okay? So let's look at statement number 3. Statement number 3 says, when my reason convinces me that something must be true, but my experience tells me the opposite, I trust my experience. So what do you value? Your logical reasoning processes or kind of what you see with your own eyes, okay? So you might think about the paradox of motion that I offered you with Parmenides or Zeno. And they made this claim that, look, I know it seems like when you see something travel a distance that it's actually moving. I know you think that. But logically, rationally, they claim that's an impossibility. So when you shoot the arrow at the target, in order for the arrow to travel from the bow to the target, it has to first travel half the distance. And then once it's traveled half the distance, in order for it to reach the target, it has to travel half the remaining distance. And so on and so on and so on. We just keep cutting this remaining distance down in half. And what we find is, well, we never get to the point where we can no longer divide in half. It seems like we can divide in half forever. And because it seems like we can divide in half forever, that would mean that logically the arrow never actually reaches the target, even though I think I saw it. So in that case, again, if you believe that, yeah, motion is an illusion because reason tells me so, then you're really heavily relying on your reason. But if you look at this experiment with the bow and arrow and you think like, yeah, I can see how that's kind of a logical trick, but I saw the bow hit the target and I'm going to trust my experience. If you trust your experience and said, I agree with number 3, you probably disagreed with number 6. When my experience convinces me that something is the case, but my reason tells me it's illogical, I trust my reason. So you see the magician cut the person in half. You don't run up on stage and say, how dare you, you scoundrel, murdering this poor person. You just know that what I'm seeing isn't happening. It's not, at least it's not happening in the way that I think it is. It's an illusion. It's like that, the mirage on the hot desert highway. It's not really water, even though my perception of it is. Okay. So the reality is, you might have said agree with both of these because it sort of depends. There's going to be some situations like with the magician where you really trust your logic and your reason and not your sense, perception, and experience. But there's going to be other times when you say like, look, you tell me not to believe my lion eyes, but I see what I see. Another question with profound implications. Number 4, when we come into the world at birth, the mind is like a blank slate. We come into the world and there's nothing in our minds until we start to have some experiences. And then those experiences start to write on that blank slate. On the other hand, you might have said yes to number 7. If you said yes to number 7, you have to say no to number 4. If you say agree to number 7, you have to disagree with number 4. Because number 7 says, we don't come into the world as a blank slate. There's actually some ideas that are kind of hardwired into who we are, or can at least be known by the sheer force of reason. Things like the laws of logic, the basic principles of math, cause and effect, the concept of perfection, the idea of God, moral concepts, and we'll look at all of those coming up. But there are folks who are going to make the argument that the laws of logic aren't something that you discover in the world out there. You just see representations of laws of logic out there. For example, you know that a thing, whatever it is, can't be both what it is and what it isn't at the same time. Okay? A thing can't be both what it is and what it isn't. It can't be both raining and not raining at the same time in the same place. The light can't be both on and off at the same time. So you see lots of representations of this. But it seems like a pretty ironclad law of logic, right? This law of contradiction. Is it something we learn by experiencing things in the world, or is this something that's kind of hardwired into us that we see then reflected in events as we go through our lives? All right. Knowledge, probability, and certainty. Our knowledge of reality can never be absolutely certain, but if a belief is true and we have sufficient evidence of its probability, we have knowledge. Okay? So this is the belief that, look, we can't ever be certain about the way that reality is, but we can be pretty sure. And if we're pretty sure about something, we're going to call that knowledge. On the other hand, look at what you said for 8. If you said, I agree with 8, what you're saying is, look, I can use reason to have absolute certainty about some features of reality. Like the example I just gave you. I know through the law of logic that it cannot be both raining and not raining at the same time. I am certain about that. Okay? And that would mean that I would probably have to disagree with statement number 5, because I just came up with something that I think I can be certain with, and it's not based on my experience or my observation, and it's not probably true that it's either raining or not raining outside right now. I'm certain it's true through reason. So I might agree with sentence number 8, but disagree with number 5. All right. Finally, number 9. We can have universal and objective knowledge of how reality consistently appears to the human mind, but we cannot know what reality is like in itself. So this is a really tricky one. And if you didn't know how to respond to this, I understand. We'll get to it soon. But essentially what this one is saying is there's some affinity between the way our minds experience reality and the way that reality is actually structured, so that we can't actually get outside of our minds to experience reality sort of firsthand. We're always just kind of one step away from it, and have to take in sense data from reality and process it into kind of a mental event. But the argument for number 9 would be, for that to happen, there has to be some sort of similarity between the way that human minds are structured and the way that reality is structured. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to talk to one another. It'd be like trying to put an Xbox disc in a PlayStation. They can't interact. So statement number 9 says, well, even though we don't get out of ourselves to experience reality directly, we can know some things about what reality is like by the ways that our minds sort of process it. You might have said, if you said no to number 9, you probably said yes to or agree with number 10. There's no absolute truth. For when I say something is true, I am saying nothing more than it is true for me, or that the vast majority of people in my society agree that it's true. This would be called epistemological relativism. Again, it's sort of a popular, particularly right now, it's sort of a popular position for people to hold. Although, again, it's not one they hold very consistently. We talk a lot about lived experience, which is a weird term because there is no experience that's not lived. So all experience is lived experience. But we talk about lived experience and my truth as if those have some sort of validity just because we own them. But if that were the case, then again, we go back to sort of our first position. If the only truth that exists is my truth, then that's going to require that I live in a particular way that's probably going to be fairly uncomfortable for me. So yes, it's my truth that skinning puppies alive is wrong. But if it's your truth that it's not, then I don't have any basis on which to claim that what you're doing is wrong, because we each have our own truths. And if we each have our own truths, and that's the only truths that exist, then we don't have any basis on which we can make a judgment about the things that people do. And so that means then we're just going to focus on the things that we like and don't like, and we're going to try to get people to join our side, to force people who think differently to do things our way. Because at the end of the day, there's no rational basis to appeal to. So if you embrace number 10, you're embracing a pretty precarious worldview. You're not going to have any basis on which to oppose things like genocides or other human rights kinds of issues, because everybody just has their own truth, or my society has its own truth, and there's no basis on which we can judge one society as better or worse than another. All right, so try to get a sense of where you're at. What do you seem to value? Do you think that it's possible to have knowledge of reality? If so, what seem to be some of the ways you think are ways of acquiring that knowledge? And how do you know what to do when you find yourself conflicted between what you seem to be experiencing and what your reason tells you?